Okay. Waiting for the last stragglers. I see them down that hallway. All right, I believe that we are on page 45. Page 45 in the notebook. Acts chapter 12, if you want to turn to your Bibles, which I should probably do. I want to remind everybody that we are having Trunk or Treat this Saturday. That's coming up quick. So if you want to have a trunk, please sign up. If you want to bring candy, please bring it to the office. If you want to help in the back, we'll have cocoa, and I don't know if we're having snacks or not. There's going to be a bunch of candy. People can just eat candy. Anyway, if you want to help in the back, please sign up for that. We're going to do that this Saturday. I forgot what time it starts. Is it on this announcement? 6 to 8 p.m., yes. 6 to 8 p.m. So if you want to help with that, please sign up on either board, I think, has the sign-up sheets. All right, Acts chapter 12 is where we are today. So I talked about a lot of this last week in chapter 12 as we're transitioning in Acts, the 30-year period really of Acts. We're transitioning into elder authority. I talked about a bit of that, and I think chapter 12 is one of the chapters that really highlights that transition in combination with chapter 15. We're going to see in chapter 15 as well that there's a more and more involvement with elders as they are taking on more and more authority. So this is, I think, part of that, and then there's some other things about chapter 12 that we're going to talk about as well. And as I said previously, I think this is a meanwhile story. This is not in chronological order so much as this is so they're doing things in Antioch at the end of chapter 11, and I think while the stuff is going on in Antioch, this is what's happening back in Jerusalem. And this is one of the last stretches of Acts. It might be the last. One of the last that is not predominantly Paul-focused. Even in chapter 15, of course, we go back to Jerusalem. They have the council. There's even Paul's the instigator for that. They decide to go back and have that sort of council about stuff. So this is one of the last places in Acts that is not primarily about Paul. This is about, of course, James and Peter. So let's read Acts chapter 12, 1 through 5. Acts 12, 1 through 5. Oh, I wanted to say one more thing about chapter 11 before we move on from chapter 11. At the end of chapter 11, right, we have the what's his name? Agabus. This is in verse 28. A man named Agabus, of course, stands up and says there's going to be a famine. And then what do they all decide to do when they hear there's a famine? Yes, they determined everyone to send relief to the brothers living in Judea. This is going to be a common refrain in Acts, and I think it's an important thing to note as we go through the book of Acts. A lot of what we've seen already in Acts, the things that the church is doing sort of corporately together, has to do with providing for people's needs, right? When do we see that first? I heard like two mumblings. We see it in the widows in Acts chapter 6. That's not the first time, but we do see it there. Yeah, Acts chapter 2. The fellowship of believers. Acts chapter 2, verse 45. They were selling their possessions and distributing. And then it happens again in Acts chapter 4, verse 32, the full number of those who believed were of one heart and soul, and no one said that the things that belonged to him were his own, but they had everything in common. Verse 34, there was not a needy person among them. Then, of course, chapter 6, right? The daily distribution to the widows for the food. And then we have in chapter 11, back in chapter 11, we see this continuing. This is one of the patterns of behavior of the early church. Is if there is need, they work to meet it. they work in the local group in Jerusalem, but as the church spreads beyond the local group in Jerusalem, that function of the church doesn't stop, right? It expands. Now they're not just meeting the needs of the Christians in Jerusalem. Now they're meeting the needs of Christians where? Wherever. That's a trick question. It's not any specific place. It's wherever there's need, right? So this is a thing that I wanted to note about the early church that they do fairly often is when there's physical need, they band together and sort of help out where they can. So let's read Acts chapter 12, 1 through 5. About that time, Herod the king laid violent hands on some of those who belonged to the church. He killed James, the brother of John, with a sword. And when he saw that it pleased the Jews, he proceeded to arrest Peter also. This was during the days of unleavened bread. And when he had seized him, he put him in prison, delivering him over to 4 squads of soldiers to guard him, intending after the Passover to bring him out to the people. Very similar to what? Christ. Very similar to Christ, right? After the Passover, he's brought out to the people. That's what they did with Jesus, right? They presented him to the people, and they're like, do you want this guy or I always get it mixed up. Barsabbas? Is it Barsabbas? Anyway, very similar to what happened to Jesus. Let's see here. So Peter was kept in prison, but earnest prayer for him was made by God to God by the church. Why would the death of James please the Jews? Yeah, he's a heretic, right? A blasphemer. He is put to death. They would be all very happy about that. This blasphemer. It's very similar to Jesus, right? They're all cheering about Jesus' death too. So, evokes a lot of the same imagery as Jesus. I think about Peter a lot in these circumstances. John 21, 18 through 19. Let's read that. John 21, 18 through 19. I have it on number 2 on page 45. If you came in a little bit late, we're on page 45. Come on. John 21, 18 and 19. This is, of course, after the whole deal of Simon, do you love me more than these, etc., etc. Verse 18, truly, truly, I say to you, when you were young, you used to dress yourself and walk wherever you wanted. But when you are old, you will stretch out your hands, and another will dress you and carry you where you do not want to go. This he said to show by what kind of death he was to glorify God. And after this he said, follow me. Do you think when he's arrested over and over again, how many times do you think he goes back to that, thinking about Jesus' promise about his death? He's being bound. You're going to go where you don't want to go. I mean, that's what happens when you're arrested, right? Is you're bound and you go where you don't want to go. How would you handle knowing how you're going to die? Would you like to have that info? You say no. Several people say no. I don't know. I go back and forth on it. I think it really is an interesting idea of Peter's personality and persona. When you think about him working in the New Testament, working in the early church, somebody who's been told how he's going to die. Now, it's hard to know if he knew that's what Jesus meant at the beginning. Maybe he didn't know that then and he figured it out later. But of course, in 1st and 2 Peter, he does indicate that he knows he's going to die soon. I just think that would be very, I don't know, maybe it would be freeing. I guess it depends on your perspective. And I want to have a brief moment to talk about this. As a Christian, what should be different about how we view death than the rest of the world? Why? Okay. When you say no fear of death, what do you mean? Yeah, and there's two different things I want to focus on. There's the fear of the big word death, right? This nebulous idea of death and what comes after, which I think is different than the fear of dying, right? Those are two different things. The process of dying itself, I think something that we're going to have to experience in some way or another. And I think there's apprehension about that. I don't think we should just feel totally I think it's natural to feel apprehension about the process of dying. I don't want to misstate that. But of course, the idea of, and I think Steve said it not being the end. And of course, Paul talking about not Paul, Bob. I knew I was going to do that eventually to people because we talk about Paul so much. The confident hope of the end, of it not being the end, rather. So Peter and James, of course, killed here in chapter 12. And then Peter's going to be arrested. Herod wants to kill him. And of course, we know that Paul's going to have this happen to him later on as he's put in house arrest. And he starts writing about when he's going to die. And one of the things you see in Acts over and over and over is the potential for death did not change their behavior. What did it do? Yeah, and I guess saying it didn't change their behavior is not correct because it did change their behavior. How did it change their behavior? Strengthen them? Carl? Yeah, that was the word I was wondering if anybody would say. It gave them urgency. So when we think about death for the Christian, Paul, of course, has this great statement, right? To live is Christ, to die is gain. And then he goes on to say, right, to die would be better for me, but to remain here is better for who? Well, not, yeah, for when he's writing, it's the Christians, right, that he's writing to. Better for you, that I can have more fruitful labor for the Lord. So as we think about Peter here, they're praying earnestly for the church. I don't know if Peter's afraid of dying. I don't think he is. But what it really did is it made them work harder for the kingdom. Because when they're dead, then they can't work for the kingdom anymore. So I want us to think about, of course, I'm trying to think of the right way to say this. Being spiritual people, part of being spiritual is adjusting your perspective on death. Our lives are not designed to be, for the people who are not Christians, for the lost, this life is it, right? And that informs a lot of the way people live. For us, death is not the end, but that should also inform the way that we live. It should change the way we live. Let's see here. 6 through 19. And unless anybody has anything they want to say about that. Lee? Yeah. And that's what happens in life, right? Lee's talking about, of course, going under the knife and not knowing the outcome. But what happens in life is we get complacent, right? And we just kind of get into a mode of, well, this is my daily life and I'm doing my stuff and nothing. And humans have a great capacity to ignore death, right? We just sort of push it out of our minds. But again, the motivation, the urgency to what Lee is saying, that make things right with God, I think that should be prevalent. Verse 6. Now when Herod was about to bring him out that very night, Peter was sleeping between two soldiers, bound with two chains, and sentries before the door were guarding the prison. Why is Luke going into so much detail here? Yeah, re-emphasizing the severity of his imprisonment, right? He's not just going to slip out. So we have two soldiers bound with two chains and sentries at the door. Behold, an angel of the Lord stood next to him, and a light shone in the cell. And he struck Peter on the side and woke him up, saying, "Get up quickly." And the chains fell off his hands. I love the way that that's phrased. The way I envision it really is Peter's laying there and the angel kicks him in the side. Really is how I envision it. The word struck is interesting there. And the angel said to him, "Dress yourself and put on your sandals." And he did so. And he said to him, "Wrap your cloak around you and follow me." And he went and followed him out. He went out and followed him, rather. He did not know what was being done by the angel was real. But he thought he was seeing a vision. Why did he think that, do you think? Why would an angel show him a vision of him escaping? I've always wondered about this. Seems ridiculous. Okay? Maybe, but it doesn't say that. He said specifically, he thought he was seeing a vision, which is different word than dreaming. Okay, he has had visions before, so this is not totally unprecedented. When did he have a vision before? A couple of times, really. We had the sheet coming down in Acts chapter 10. I think he saw a vision of a man. Did he see a vision of a man in Acts chapter 10? I don't remember. No, I think it was just the sheet descending. So it's not unprecedented. Let's keep reading here. What verse do we leave off in? Yes, it is a new experience. Maybe he probably, of course, hasn't experienced angels behaving in this manner. So maybe he's thinking, it's much more likely that this is a vision than this is really happening, right? I think that's probably a reasonable thing. When they passed the first and second guard, they came to the iron gate leading to the city. It opened for them of its own accord, and they went out and went along the street, and immediately the angel left him. And when Peter came to himself, that idea of coming to himself, like, He comes out of this trance. Oh, it wasn't a vision. It was really happening. He said, "Now I am sure the Lord has sent his angel and rescued me from the hand of Herod and from all the Jewish people were expecting." Where do we want to go to? Let's see here. Now we'll keep reading. When he realized this, he went to the house of Mary, the mother of John, whose other name was Mark. Why is this a relevant person? What is he going to do in the future? Missionary journeys with at least one. Yeah, Gospel of Mark. This is the dude that wrote what we've been studying on Sunday mornings. And Luke is masterful at this. I wonder how much the Spirit, you think about the narrative, how we structure narratives. I don't know how much the Spirit dictated this, or if this is Luke and this, I don't know. It's hard to know about inspiration, but Luke is masterful at introducing important people that are going to be important later on, and then he just sort of introduces them and then brings them back later. He's done this several times already. He did this, of course, in chapter 6, right? He did that with Stephen and Philip and the seven. Then, of course, we had the thing about Stephen, and then we had the thing about Philip. And then if he did that in Acts chapter 8, who did he introduce at the beginning of chapter 8? Saul. He introduced Saul, right? Saul was standing there while they were killing Stephen. So he introduces Saul, doesn't go to Saul immediately, and then returns to Saul later. Luke is just so good at this. So here we have John, whose other name was Mark, where many were gathered together and praying. And when he knocked at the door of the gateway, a servant girl named Rhoda came to answer. Recognizing Peter's voice in her joy, she did not open the gate, but ran in and reported that Peter was standing at the gate. Obviously, the gate was locked, right? So this, again, very interesting details in this story. She hears, I guess she couldn't see Peter. I guess the gate must have been a bigger gate, right? That he's behind and he's saying, he's knocking, let me in, let me in. And she just gets so excited. Let's see here, verse 15. They said to her, "You are out of your mind," which is, again, a reasonable assumption. It's much more likely that she is going crazy than what? Yeah, that he's somehow been miraculously released from prison. But she kept insisting that it was so, and they kept saying, "It is his angel." What does that mean? It is his angel. Okay, so maybe they think it's his spirit post-death. Or what else? It might also mean that they think it's a messenger from Peter. All right, because the word angel, right? It is his messenger. So I'm not sure. It's hard to know because of context, right? It's hard to know when you think of this word, the word here, angelos, which literally means messenger. I'm inclined to think that it's really just that they're saying it's somebody that's been sent by Peter, as opposed to it's Peter himself. Yeah, but now obviously this is the other people, right? This is the people in the house. So she goes in and says, it's Peter, and they say, no, it can't be Peter. It must be somebody that Peter sent, right? That makes, I think, sense to me. But Peter continued knocking, and when they opened, they saw him and were amazed. He motioned to them with his hand to be silent. But motioning to them with his hand to be silent, he described how the Lord had brought him out of the prison. And he said, tell these things to James and to the brothers. Then he departed and went to another place. Now when day came, there was no little disturbance among the soldiers, of course, over what had become of Peter. And after Herod searched for him and did not find him, he examined the sentries in order that they be put to death, and he went down from Judea to Caesarea to spend time there. Okay. Both Peter and the people in Mary's house, I don't think it's a coincidence, they both fail to recognize God's providence immediately. Why? Why do you think that is? Peter in the prison, how does he fail to recognize it? Yeah, this is not really happening. This is just a vision. How in Mary's household, how did they fail to recognize it? It's just a messenger. It's not really Peter. Why do you think that is? Yes. We generally gravitate towards the most common or most ordinary explanation. Now, is that a bad behavior in general? No, it's not a bad. I don't want to misunderstand. That's good behavior to get into. Is the idea that we're going to just generally search for the most likely solution. We do that in every area of our life. That's what we do, right? We do that when the sink stops running, and when the car makes a funny noise, and when we can't find our keys, whatever. We immediately default. And we don't go through this consciously. Let's be clear about that. It's not like we're consciously running through and thinking about, sometimes we do, but most of the time our brains automatically default to the most ordinary likely situation. So this is a common behavior for Peter and Mary. And even in the age of miracles, that's still probably the right thing to do. Why? Yeah, miracles are still very rare. They're very unusual things. You can't go around assuming that everything's a miracle, otherwise what? What happens if you do that? What's the predominant danger in doing that? The predominant danger is listening to a teacher who is not from God, right? If the miracles are designed to confirm the word of God, and if you are too free in your interpretation of miracles, then you're much more likely to be bamboozled by somebody like Simon, for example, who was doing whatever he was doing. You're much more likely to be led astray by some false teacher who's doing some false miracle, right? So it's still the right idea, I think, to have that sort of attitude. But, of course, what's the problem? And I think this happens for us, too. When we default to and we only ever try to look for mundane, what does the word mundane mean? Average, usual, ordinary, common. I use the word mundane. Mundane in contrast with what? Supernatural or divine, right? So when we only ever look for the mundane explanation for things, what's the danger in that? Yes, not giving God credit for what he's done. And to be clear, is God doing things today? Yes, he is doing things today. It's harder to tell. Why? Yeah, because he's not doing it through people. He's doing it through providence, right? But if you never accept that God is working in the world, you're going to miss faith-affirming, God-glorifying opportunities for gratitude, right? You're going to miss that. So I think there's a balance to be struck there. And as we see here, they do eventually figure it out, and what do they immediately do? When they figure it out, what do they do? They praise God, right? Peter says, now I am sure that the Lord has sent his angel and rescued me. And then Mark, of course, and Mary, the household of Mary, they're all very excited and they're joyful and they're amazed. So I think we need to sort of have that balance. Larry? Yeah. Yeah, for those who didn't hear what Larry said, the idea of those who look at nature and just think that there's no possibility of God's existence, right? That's the classic example of this, is where you get so wrapped up in the mundane, the ordinary, that, and to be clear, Scripture is clear about nature as an evidence of the miraculous or the divine, right? Where does Scripture say that? Yeah, that's in Psalms. Romans 1 and 2 talk about it a lot. So this idea of being willing to see God's providence and give him the credit. I think we have to cultivate that attitude. Not that we're going to, and again, there's a balance to be struck there. Go ahead. Yeah. Yeah, cultivating an attitude of thanksgiving for our prayers. What Don is saying is when our prayers come to pass, being thankful for it. And I think this is interesting. This is sort of off the rails here, but it's an important point. How often do you go back and thank God for things that you prayed for previously? Right? Because it's easy to get in the mindset of I'm just going to pray for what I want, and then it happens, and then I enjoy the benefits of it, but I never go back and thank God for it, right? And I feel like, that's not the right way to say that. That can create in our hearts pride, apathy, right? If we're not being thankful, it's easy to forget God's hand in our lives. We need to be conscious and intentional about that. Yeah, the lepers that Jesus sent to get healed, or he what was it? What's that story? Did he send? Yeah, only one came back. That's right. Jesus heals these lepers, and they all leave, and then and what does he say? Where are the other guys? Why are they not coming back and thanking me? Because those who are cultivating a spiritual heart is cultivating a heart of thanksgiving. Anyway, let's see here. These questions. I want to make sure we're doing the notes. Why were they all at Mary's house? Verse 12. I heard like a mumbled on. Yeah, they're probably praying about Peter, verse 5. So Peter was kept in prison, but earnest prayer from him was made to God by the church. And then verse 12, they went to the house of Mary, the mother of John, whose other name was Mark, where they were all gathered together and were praying. Is there a lesson for us in this? Maybe not. Maybe it totally doesn't matter. Huh? Okay, to believe what you pray for. What did you say back here? The power of prayer. What else? Okay, God does answer prayer. Yeah, praying together. I really want to highlight that idea of this. They could have all been in their individual houses praying. They could have been doing that. And in fact, they do that probably all the time. But there's a particular thing going on in the circumstance of the church, and so they decide to get together and pray. Now, we do this, I think. We've done this in the past. We've had special prayer. No, prayer service is not the right way of saying it. Special times of prayer, right? But I do think that I'll come back to you, Carl. I think there's a particular power in collective prayer. What makes collective prayer different from individual prayer? Carl? Okay, so we're all doing the same thing at the same time. Why is that good? What does that do? Okay, reinforces the need. There is perhaps an idea of a demonstration of our need to God in the fact that we're taking the effort to gather together. What else? Yeah, there's a lot of benefits for us, right? The comfort of being together, the security of being together, and knowing that everybody cares about the same thing. Did you have more you want to say? I feel like I kind of cut you off. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, and the idea, remember what's happening. I'll come back to you, Don. Remember what's happening here. Why are they gathered? Somebody got arrested, right? So they're gathering together, I think, really provides them all with a level of security and a sort of safety in numbers sort of idea. Maybe they think if we're all in our own homes, then they can just come and arrest us at any time, but let's all get together and it'll sort of be better. Hold on, Don was first and then Carl. Yeah, unity of purpose. Yeah. Yeah, they're praying for a lot of different things at once. Yeah, and it's interesting the point that James just died, right? Literally, James just got killed. So they're comforting one another over that. They're praying for Peter. They don't want to lose two in one situation. The thinking about the future of the church maybe and the danger of persecution. Carl? Yeah. Yes. Yeah, it's not like James was in a car accident and then Peter was arrested in a totally unconnected thing, right? The guy that arrested Peter is the guy that killed James. So I think there's a lot of fear and so in times of fear and insecurity, they're gathering together for comfort and peace, right? And supporting one another. And I think this is an important thing I think maybe something that we could do more perhaps is these gathered times of prayer, because I think it's clear in the text that's why they're together. They're not gathering for some other purpose and then happening to pray. They are gathering with the expressive intent to pray. Did I cut you off again, Carl? So somebody was saying. Yeah, the prayer of a righteous man availeth much, or whatever the version that yours says. Yeah. Let's see. Do we cover all these? Who does Peter tell them to inform of his release? Yes. James, tell these things to James and the brothers. Why is that important? Which James is this? Yeah, which James is this? It's hard to know. That's the assumption. I think that's the assumption. James, the brother of Jesus. Well, who is James? What is his position? He is an elder. And again, I think really we're seeing a transition in chapter 12. Not a transition. That's not the right way. Transition's not the right way of saying it. I shouldn't be saying transition. Because it's not like the apostles are abdicating authority. The addition of elder authority in the church. Verse 11:30, they did so, sending it to the elders by the hand of Barnabas and Saul. Then Peter gets arrested, James gets killed, and Peter goes into hiding, but tell James and the other brothers. So again, we're seeing this addition of another group of authoritative people, I think, in the church. Any other comments about that before we go on to the next section? Well, verse 19, after Herod searched for him and did not find him. Of course, we don't know. The text is condensed so much, right? So we don't know how long he looked. We don't know. We just don't know the circumstances of it. I do think. So the soldiers tell the story, presumably tell it honestly. What does Herod probably think? Well, what does Herod think about the story probably? He probably thinks they're either insane or lying, right? Because if he believed the story, then what? Then you'd have to acknowledge that Peter is from God. You'd have to acknowledge that. If an angel came and released Peter from prison, you'd have to acknowledge, if you believed that to be true, you'd have to acknowledge that you're in the wrong and Peter's in the right. So Herod's not going to do that, clearly. So I think and other times soldiers were killed for their failure. But I do think it sort of maybe added to it here of if he lets them live and sort of there's an acknowledgement of this supernatural event, he has to kill them in large part to keep his own internal narrative consistent, right? These guys must be insane. I need to put them to death. They're obviously not very good at their jobs. Carl? Yeah. And that would happen sometimes is that a guard or a jailer would be bribed. And so, just a blanket rule, if the prisoner escapes, they're all killed because I don't want people taking bribes, right? Sort of nipping that in the bud. The thing I wonder about is if this event was a catalyst for any of their conversions. You're a soldier and you see this happen. I don't know. These things there are things in the narrative we never get to know, and I do wonder about. But I hope, I guess I should say is I hope that this was a catalyst for some conversions in these soldiers' lives. Because I do kind of feel bad that they were put to death. I do feel bad about that, right? They're put to death, and it's not really their fault. There's nothing they could have done. You're not doing anything to an angel, so it's not like they did a bad job. It wasn't like they were failing. But, of course, ultimately, I hope they were converted before they were put to death. We got to move on from this story. I'll do one more comment. Okay. Let's do the death of Herod, verse 20. Now Herod was angry with the people of Tyre and Sidon, and they came to him with one accord, and having persuaded Blastus, the king, what a good name. Blastus. Should have named Gideon Blastus. Anyway, having persuaded Blastus, the king's chamberlain, they asked for peace because their country depended on the king's country for food. On an appointed day, Herod put on his royal robes, took his seat upon the throne, and delivered an oration to them. And the people were shouting, "The voice of God and not a man." And immediately an angel of the Lord struck him down because he did not give the God the glory. But he was eaten by worms and breathed his last. But the word of God increased and multiplied. And Barnabas and Saul returned from Jerusalem when they had completed their service, bringing with them John, whose other name was Mark. And we see John returning to the narrative, or Mark rather. How did Herod die? Eaten by worms. I don't know if the worms ate him while he was alive or was he dead. It's hard to say. Ultimately, we don't know the physical mechanism of his death. He was struck by an angel, which could present how? Whatever. The angel can do whatever he wants, right? Could be any number of ways he actually died. And then he was eaten by, I don't know if he was eaten by worms while he was alive. I guess it says he was eaten by worms and breathed his last, so maybe he was eaten by worms while he was alive. Ooh, what a bad way to go. That's probably top. Yeah, internal tapeworms perhaps inside. So maybe the angel just puts a bunch of worms in him. I don't know. Bad way to go, really. And so, okay, the angel kills Herod. Do you think God often directly intervenes like this? This is not a miracle, to be clear, right? What is this? This is divine, you can call it what you want, divine intervention or providence or something, right? This is the classic difference, right, between God acting directly in the world and a miracle is that none of the Christians do it, right? They're not involved in it. It's not a supernatural thing done by a human agent. This is just something that God does. Do you think God still does stuff like this today? Here's the second question, right? How do we know? That's the question. How would we? We wouldn't, ultimately. But I would suggest to you that when we are praying, this is the kind, not that you're praying for God to kill people, although maybe you are. You need to have a change of attitude about that. But when we're praying, this is the kind of action that we are asking God to do. Right? I'll come back to you, Larry. We're asking God to change the natural course of events. Now, again, hopefully you're not asking God to smite people. But God could still do stuff like this today, and we would have no idea, right? I don't know. Larry? Yeah. Yes, absolutely. We do know that God is still working in the world, especially in terms of authorities, ruling authorities. So for us, of course, it's hard to know. We know that this happened to Herod because God told us that it happened to Herod. But if this just happened to a random so-and-so, it would be nigh impossible to say, well, God did that. That's the difficulty for us in providence, right? And this goes back to our previous point. Okay, I think that God still works in the world today. On the other hand, because it's impossible to know, we have to be careful. And you think about what happened with Peter and Mary's household. We have to be careful assigning specific cause and effect to things and saying, well, God definitely did that supernaturally. We have to be careful in how we pronounce judgment about that because it's very difficult to know. What's the overall attitude that we should have about such things? Well, gratitude, yes, but I think really what we're driving at is having faith that God has promised to cause all things to work together for good for those who love God, right? We have faith that that's true. Even if I don't know the mechanics of it, I do believe that God is working in the world for the benefit of his kingdom. And there's going to be times where he does stuff and nobody ever knows. That's got to be the case. That he's doing things in the world and nobody's ever really sure 100% that he definitely struck a dude dead. I don't know. Maybe he did, maybe he didn't. But having the overall attitude of faith that God is working things for his kingdom, for the benefit of his glory, even if I don't ever specifically know it. Now, I know it here because he told me. Yes, that's important to note. Yeah, even if it happens with something we don't like, is having the attitude of faith that God is working things for the benefit of his kingdom. And knowing that there's going to be times where that's maybe something I don't like. Why? Why would God do something that we don't like? Yeah, the simple answer is because we're dumb. We're dumb, and we like things that are not good for us, right? And for, of course, the serious answer, right? Because God knows that that's for the benefit of his kingdom. But we who have a limited perspective on things, who are so finite in our view of the universe, we're going to want things that are ultimately not in the interests of God's glory or his kingdom. And we have to be humble enough to have the faith that God knows what he's doing, right? Was that the second bell? Man, I thought for sure I'd get done with one lesson. No. Yes. Yeah, Stephen's death. We would not have prayed for Stephen to die, but of course we know that God used that to benefit the kingdom. Anyway, we're out of time.